China's warning to Washington is not routine diplomatic noise. It is Beijing saying the tanker interdictions have changed the game. The moment a shipment of Venezuelan crude headed for Chinese buyers gets intercepted, the story stops being only pressure on Caracas and becomes a test of whether the United States can reach into international waters and decide which energy flows are allowed to move. China has been Venezuela's biggest outlet for crude for years, so this is not a symbolic dispute. It touches supply security, credibility, and national pride. That is why China calls the seizures a violation of international law and condemns unilateral sanctions that try to police other countries' trade. Here is the reframe most people miss. If Washington can make Venezuelan oil effectively untouchable even for non-US customers, then the real lever is not Venezuela's politics. The real lever is access, shipping insurance, dollar clearing, port services, and the implied threat that any intermediary can be punished. That pressure does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be unpredictable enough that captains hesitate, insurers raise premiums, and traders price in fear. Energy becomes the instrument, but the target is precedent. Can one power set rules for everyone else? Or are we moving into a world where those rules get challenged in real time? Geography makes this even sharper. The Western Hemisphere has long been treated by Washington as a special security space, and today's rhetoric about keeping rivals out echoes that tradition, whether leaders cite it directly or not. So Chinese involvement in Venezuelan oil is read less like neutral commerce and more like a rival testing boundaries close to home. Beijing hears the same message in reverse. Your growth can be pinched wherever U.S. reach extends if you let this become normal. Now, for the part that should make you uneasy. On paper, American power looks overwhelming. In practice, enforcement is messy. Announcing a blockade is easy. Holding it together day after day is a grind of legal thresholds, boarding capability, ship identification, and split-second decisions on a moving deck. Every delay becomes a signal. Every workaround becomes a blueprint. If enforcement looks hesitant, it invites defiance. If it turns forceful, it raises the odds of an incident no one planned for, but everyone will have to answer for. In the next few minutes, I'll show you the single operational detail that decides whether this stays a managed standoff, turns into an economic war, or becomes a dangerous accident at sea. Before we get to the operational detail that decides where this goes, you need to understand what China is actually defending. It is not about Venezuela's government or ideology. It is the right to buy what it wants from whom it wants without needing permission from Washington. Start with energy security. China's economy relies on imported oil, and a large share of that oil arrives by sea. In Beijing, that is not treated like a normal commercial risk. It is treated like a strategic exposure that other powers could exploit in a crisis. If your growth, prices, and domestic calm depend on tankers showing up on schedule, then a public interdiction is not a small event. It is a warning about how quickly the rules can be changed on you. Then there is diversification. Every big importer tries to avoid being trapped in one region or one supplier. Venezuelan crude is not irreplaceable, but it gives China options. It spreads risk away from any single theater, and it signals that China can keep relationships alive even when the United States tries to isolate a target. That is why this is not charity. It is leverage and insurance, both at once, and it buys room to maneuver later. Now add the political cost of looking powerless. Great powers can swallow economic losses. They struggle to swallow embarrassment. If Chinese buyers sign contracts, tankers sail, and the U.S. can stop those cargoes with little resistance, Beijing looks exposed. Partners notice. Rivals test harder. Inside China, the argument becomes simple. If you cannot protect trade, you cannot credibly claim great power status. That face element pushes leaders toward a firm response even when the immediate loss is manageable. Oil makes this sharper than most goods because it carries a built-in fear mechanism. The system around it is crowded with gatekeepers, insurers, flag registries, ship owners, port services, banks, and compliance departments. The moment interdictions look plausible, costs rise before any barrel is actually blocked. Premiums move, routes change, brokers price in risk. That market psychology is the point. You do not need to seize every tanker. You only need enough examples that the next captain hesitates, the next insurer adds surcharges, and the next bank delays payment. Finally, there is geography and choke points. Countries that depend on seaborne energy obsess over narrow straits and heavily monitored routes because those are places where pressure can be applied quickly. Chinese strategists have discussed this vulnerability for years, not because they expect an immediate blockade, but because they know the threat works even as a rumor. If Washington proves it will interfere with energy flows far from China's coast, Beijing has to assume similar pressure could be applied closer to home as well. U.S. Energy Information Administration. So when you hear China talk about sovereignty and unilateral bullying, listen to the incentive underneath. China is trying to stop a precedent from hardening. Today it is Venezuelan oil. Tomorrow it is any oil that becomes politically convenient to label illegitimate. Once that becomes normal, this stops being about Caracas. It becomes a direct contest over who sets the rules of global trade. This is the moment where grand strategy collides with maritime reality. A government can announce a blockade and make it sound absolute. The ocean is not absolute. Enforcement is not a headline. It is a sequence of actions that has to work on a specific ship, in specific weather, with specific people, under a legal framework that punishes hesitation and punishes overreaction. Consider a standoff described in press reporting around a sanctioned tanker, often called Bella 1. The ship was tracked, approached, and then refused boarding. Authorities did not immediately climb aboard. They waited for the right boarding capability to arrive. That delay matters more than any speech. A single defiant vessel forces a choice in public view. Do you escalate fast and risk injuries and diplomatic fallout, or do you hold back and show that your blockade has seams? Either way, the world learns what your announcement is worth. Here is why interdiction is harder than it looks from the shore. It resembles high-risk law enforcement, not conventional war. Boarding a moving deck requires specialists trained to secure ladders, control crew movement, clear compartments, and de-escalate tense encounters in seconds. It requires helicopters, fast boats, medical support, and a command chain that knows the rules of engagement down to the detail. You need legal thresholds too. What authorizes a stop, what justifies a search, how evidence is preserved, what counts as resistance, and who signs off on each step. Raw naval power does not solve those problems automatically. A destroyer can dominate a horizon and still be the wrong tool for repetitive compliance work. A blockade is not one dramatic raid. It is dozens of inspections, detentions, and follow-up actions, day after day, without a major mistake. The bottleneck is rarely missiles. The bottleneck is trained boarding teams positioned close enough to act quickly with procedures that keep a single boarding from becoming an international incident. There is also a quiet institutional constraint. Different agencies own different parts of the mission. Military presence can deter, but the actual boarding authority, evidence handling, and custody process often sit with specialized Coast Guard-style units. Those units are finite, rotated, and sometimes far away. So a blockade can look ironclad on paper while depending on a small number of people and a narrow logistics window. And even when you have the team, the clock works against you. You need to identify the ship with confidence, close distance without provoking panic, and then carry out the boarding while cameras roll and radios chatter. Every step has paperwork behind it, lawyers on standby, and political leaders who want results but not blame. That is the reality behind interdict in practice. Now zoom out to the strategic signal. If one tanker can stall enforcement, even briefly, it exposes the gap between rhetoric and capability. Rivals watch that gap like a heartbeat. If China believes enforcement is inconsistent, it will test workarounds. If ship owners believe the risk is uneven, they will gamble. Credibility is not what you announce. It is what you can do quickly, repeatedly, and safely when the other side refuses to cooperate. The next battlefield is not the Caribbean, it is the legal plumbing underneath the global economy. When China complains about long-arm jurisdiction, it is pointing at a mechanism that sounds abstract but works in concrete ways. The United States can punish non-U.S. actors for activity outside U.S. territory by leveraging systems that most international trade still depends on. Here is the plain version. Washington sanctions Venezuela. Then it tells the world, if you buy Venezuelan oil, ship it, insure it, finance it, or broker the deal, you risk being cut off from the U.S. financial system. That can mean losing access to dollar settlement, U.S. correspondent banking, major insurers, and large counterparties that fear secondary penalties. A tanker can be foreign flagged, crewed by non-Americans, sailing in international waters, and still be exposed because the payment, insurance, and documentation chain often runs through institutions that cannot afford to ignore Washington. China frames this as one country trying to write global rules unilaterally. From Beijing's perspective, it is not neutral law, it is leverage dressed as law. Trade becomes a permission system. Commerce is allowed unless Washington says otherwise. That is why the complaint is not only about Venezuela, it is about precedent. If one power can extend domestic prohibitions outward through finance, then sovereignty becomes conditional. Today, it is Venezuelan oil. Tomorrow, it is any supplier, any buyer, or any shipper that becomes politically inconvenient. But there is a second lens, and ignoring it leads to sloppy analysis. The United States argues that access to its market, its banks, and its currency network is a privilege, not a right. If a foreign firm wants those benefits, it accepts the conditions attached. Washington also claims that without secondary pressure, sanctions are mostly theater. Targets root around restrictions through shell companies, reflagging blended cargoes and intermediaries built to create plausible deniability. In that view, extraterritorial pressure is not a bug. It is the enforcement mechanism. So this becomes a fight over governance, not just tankers. In one model, the dominant financial center sets compliance standards and the rest of the system orbits it. In another model, multiple centers exist, none able to universalize its preferences, and trade is negotiated rather than dictated. A useful analogy is airspace. One country can control its own skies, but it cannot credibly claim every sky on Earth, even if its airports are the busiest. The US model works because so much air traffic still routes through its hubs. If you want the convenience of the hub, you inherit the hub's rules. That is why it sounds like law but behaves like power. If the US can flip a switch and make a cargo toxic, firms comply before any court weighs in. If China builds alternatives, the switch weakens. Neither side is neutral here. Both are signaling strength in public. China is trying to build new hubs, alternative payment rails, alternative insurance capacity, and deal structures designed to reduce exposure to the dollar. Every interdiction at sea turns this legal dispute into a public power contest. The question is who gets to decide what rules apply and where. To understand why this fight feels so personal to Washington, you have to think in hemispheres, not headlines. For 2 centuries, U.S. strategy has treated the Western Hemisphere as a special security zone, not because Latin America is a chessboard, but because proximity changes the meaning of outside power. A rival presence across an ocean can be managed. A rival presence in your neighborhood feels like a direct test of your ability to shape your own perimeter. That instinct has a name people recognize: the Monroe Doctrine. Most people hear it as dusty history, but the logic never really disappeared. The United States has repeatedly acted on the assumption that major outside powers should not entrench themselves in the Americas. When Chinese money, Chinese buyers, and Chinese state backing show up in a sanctioned oil trade near U.S. waters, Washington does not read it as simple commerce. It reads it as influence with a receipt, proof that China can build durable stakes inside America's traditional zone, then dare Washington to either tolerate it or pay to push it out. Now flip the perspective. Beijing looks at the same situation and sees a country using geography as a moral shield. It hears, "We can operate globally, but you cannot operate near us. We can defend spheres when it suits us, but we deny spheres when rivals claim them." This is where the argument stops being technical and becomes political. It is about who gets to define what counts as a rule in the first place. The United States often argues that its position is different from Russia's in Eastern Europe because America is defending stability, not conquest. It points to alliances, historical ties, and the claim that the hemisphere should not become a staging ground for hostile powers. China and Russia answer with a simpler claim: power always calls itself stability. If spheres of influence are illegitimate, then they are illegitimate for everyone. If spheres are unavoidable in practice, then every great power will enforce theirs, and weaker states will feel the squeeze. That either or matters because it shapes what each side thinks it is allowed to do next. If Washington believes the hemisphere is a hard boundary, it will treat Chinese commercial adaptation as escalation, even if it involves no soldiers, just shipping, finance, and flags of convenience. If Beijing believes the rules are just American preferences, it will treat compliance as surrender, even if compliance would reduce risk and keep markets calm. And do not forget the countries in the middle. Many governments in the region want options. They will take U.S. security cooperation and Chinese capital at the same time, and they will call that sovereignty, not provocation. This is the trap of multipolarity. In a unipolar world, enforcement looks like administration. In a contested world, enforcement looks like coercion, and coercion invites counters. Once you frame the Caribbean as a sphere boundary, every interdiction becomes a signal, and every workaround becomes a challenge. The next move will be less about Venezuela's oil and more about whether either side can back down without looking like it blinked. China's biggest problem here is not anger, it's geography. The United States can put cutters, aircraft, and allied port leverage near Venezuela in days. China cannot suddenly project a permanent maritime shield into the Caribbean without doing something dramatic, expensive, and politically explosive. So if Beijing wants to push back, it has to lean on tools that travel better than warships. That's why Beijing's most realistic response is to make enforcement costly and politically awkward, not to fight ship for ship. Start with finance and contracts. China can keep buying oil in ways that reduce exposure to U.S. pressure, but not by magic. It would mean shifting settlement channels, insulating firms that do the buying, and accepting higher transaction friction. Even when you do everything legally on paper, banks, insurers, and shippers still price in reputational and compliance risk. That is the core U.S. advantage. You don't need to chase every tanker if private actors are already scared of being the next example. Then there is diplomacy, which sounds soft until you remember what it is for. China can frame interdictions as a threat to global trade norms, rally a coalition of countries that dislike secondary sanctions, and use forums where the U.S. is not the only agenda setter. The goal is not to win a court case. The goal is to raise the political cost of enforcement and to make Washington look isolated, not principled. Economic retaliation is another lever, but it is blunt. China can target specific U.S. firms, restrict market access, slow approvals, or use procurement and regulatory pressure. The problem is symmetry. Retaliation hurts China too, and Beijing has to decide whether Venezuela is worth paying a price that could bleed into investment confidence and domestic growth. The more strategic move is acceleration. Every time the U.S. demonstrates that dollar access and maritime control can be weaponized, China gets more justification to build alternatives. Non-dollar settlement systems, regional payment networks, deeper energy partnerships with suppliers the U.S. can't easily interdict, and larger strategic reserves that reduce panic when shipments wobble. None of this is fast, but it is cumulative. The fight over a few cargoes becomes a long campaign over infrastructure. China can also respond through energy policy rather than confrontation. That means diversifying import sources, locking in long-term contracts, investing in upstream production abroad, and reducing oil intensity at home over time. Those measures don't look like pushback on a news ticker, but they change the balance of vulnerability that gives interdictions their psychological bite. Now, here's the danger zone. Because China's direct military options in the Caribbean are limited, it is tempted to seek leverage somewhere else in a domain where it has reach, technology, supply chains, critical minerals, trade, and corporate access. That is where compartmentalization can fail. The relationship can function when both sides pretend each dispute is separate. It breaks when one side decides the disputes are linked and starts trading pain across them. And even if neither side wants a crisis, friction creates its own momentum. A boarding operation goes wrong, a crew panics, a ship maneuvers badly, someone gets hurt, or a warning shot becomes a headline. At that point, the story stops being about oil contracts and starts being about prestige and revenge, which is exactly the kind of logic that turns manageable competition into a confrontation nobody planned. And this is where most people get the story wrong. They treat it like a one-off Venezuela episode, and they assume it ends when a few ships are seized or a few statements are issued. That's not how these contests work. What matters is what becomes normal. If the United States can repeatedly interfere with oil flows to a major power without paying a serious price, then the lesson for everyone is simple. Access is conditional. Not just access to U.S. markets, but access to global trade itself, because so much of it still runs through systems the U.S. can influence. If China can keep the trade alive through workarounds and make enforcement look inconsistent or politically costly, then the lesson flips. Pressure has limits, and time favors the side that can endure. Either way, the world that comes out of this looks different than the one that went into it. You get more rerouting, more secrecy, more middlemen, more gray shipping networks, more alternative payments, and more suspicion at sea. And the more routine this becomes, the more the real risk shifts from policy to execution. Not will the U.S. do it, but will someone make a mistake while doing it? because the fastest way for a managed standoff to turn into a crisis is not a grand decision in a capital. It's a bad judgment call on a moving deck in bad weather with adrenaline and cameras and politics all in the same room. If you want a simple takeaway, it's this. Blockades are not defined by announcements. They're defined by repeatable enforcement. And repeatable enforcement is exactly where friction, fatigue, and miscalculation live. So I'll leave you with one question that matters more than the talking points. If you were advising either side, what would you prioritize right now? Proving resolve in public, or reducing the chance of an incident you can't control once it starts?